Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Colin Lynch with Sunnybrook's Board of Directors. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this first speaker series of 2022. Tonight's lecture is titled Maintaining Wellness During the COVID-19 Pandemic. While we continue to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic, we have all faced a variety of different kinds of challenges, stresses, and changes in our lives. Our Sunnybrook experts will be walking you through excellent strategies, tips, and tricks on identifying if you or a loved one is experiencing anxiety, techniques to manage these feelings, and how to practice daily activities to boost mental health and prevent emotional overload. As we continue to plan for the speaker series this year, please consider joining our online mailing list to get updates about upcoming sessions. You can also refer back to this webpage to get updates about the speaker series topics for 2022. We know just how valuable these online lectures can be in connecting with you, our patients, community members, friends, and family to deliver relevant and interesting health information. I would like to now introduce you to tonight's moderator, Dr. Peggy Richter. Dr. Richter is the head of Frederick W. Thompson Anxiety Disorders Center here at Sunnybrook, and is internationally known for her work in obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. Her work aims to define better the boundaries of OCD and related spectrum disorder and improve treatment outcome. She is the author of numerous publications and scientific presentations and is an internationally acclaimed speaker on anxiety. She presents extensively to healthcare professionals and lay audiences, and we are very grateful she has agreed to moderate tonight's discussion. Thank you for being here tonight, Dr. Richter, and I'll pass the mic over to you.
Thanks so much, Colin. It's lovely to meet. We were just saying sadly that it's only virtual, but it's lovely to meet. And I wish I could see our whole audience tonight, but I'm glad to know that people are there and that we're talking to you. So good evening to everyone joining us virtually this evening for our first speaker series of 2022. My name is Dr. Peggy Richter, and as you know, I've been told I'm the head of the Frederick Thompson Anxiety Disorder Center. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate tonight's discussion. As we approach the 2-year mark of the COVID-19 pandemic, you may be experiencing some feelings of exhaustion and stress. Frankly, I don't know anyone who isn't in some way. It's difficult, especially in the face of the Omicron variant and the number of news stories increasing every day around COVID-19. So tonight's excellent lineup of Sunnybrook experts are going to present on ways you can take a step back and care for your well-being during these challenging times. Our lecture tonight is titled Maintaining Wellness During the COVID Pandemic, and we sincerely hope that this highly requested topic will provide some helpful information for you and your loved ones as we continue to navigate the changing landscape that we're all dealing with. We'll begin our evening tonight with a presentation around the relationships we're seeing between COVID infection and the development of depression and anxiety disorders. This will be followed with a presentation getting into more of the details around anxiety and some tips on how to manage it. And this will be followed last by a presentation on techniques to maintain wellness and build your resiliency. We have set aside some time at the end of the evening for you to ask our panel of speakers some questions. Thank you to everyone who's already submitted a question online prior to the event. Please also feel free to send your questions while the presentations are happening through this website. We may not be able to get to every question, but we will do our very best in the time we have available. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our first speaker. We have flipped the sequence a bit just because Dr. Levitt is dealing with some other issues and may be called away. And so we thought we'd take advantage of having him with us right now. Dr. Levitt will be speaking about the intersection between COVID, anxiety, and depression. Dr. Levitt is the chief of the Hurwitz Brain Sciences program and a wonderful speaker who I've been delighted to work with in speaking and professionally for about 14 years at Sunnybrook, not to mention about almost 15, 20 years before that, I think, Anthony. So we go back a while. So welcome, Dr. Levitt.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. It doesn't seem to want to share. Hang on a second.
There we go.
Can you see that now?
Perfect.
Okay. It's hard because I can see me, but I can't see you. All right. So I'm going to talk about the intersection between COVID, anxiety, and depression. And I'm not talking so much about strategies now. I will leave that to my two co-presenters. I'm going to talk about some of the statistics that tell us what's going on in this relationship. So I'll proceed. Okay. So I'm actually going to answer 5 questions tonight. The first, does depression or anxiety impact the risk of actually contracting COVID? The second is, depression and anxiety affect the outcome of infection if you have become infected with COVID? The third is, does COVID itself increase the risk of a subsequent episode of depression and anxiety? The fourth question is, does having depression or anxiety affect people's willingness to receive vaccination? There's all sorts of talk about who is not prepared to receive vaccination, and is it people who have depression or anxiety? That's the question I'm going to answer. And finally, does depression or anxiety affect people's burnout with the pandemic? So, the first question, does depression or anxiety impact the risk of contracting COVID? And I'm going to show you the results from 2 studies, both by a person whose last name is Wang, with 2 different people. The first one is Wang and their group from 2020, and they analyzed a nationwide database of electronic health records of 61 million adults from 360 hospitals and over 300,000 providers across 50 states in the United States up till July 29, 2020. And they looked at 4 disorders that were diagnosed in the year prior to their contracting the disorder, the COVID, and they looked at depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what you see in the graph there is what's called the odds ratio. That is the likelihood that someone with depression, for example, got COVID over someone who didn't have depression. And in their study, people were 7.6 times more likely to get COVID if they had depression, 7.3 times more likely to get COVID if they had schizophrenia, 5.9 times more likely if they had ADHD, and 5.7 times more likely to get COVID if they had bipolar disorder. Clearly a dramatic increase in risk if you had one of those disorders. However, what they didn't distinguish is those people that might have got these conditions after they got COVID. And so the next study I'm going to show you, so the conclusion here was recently diagnosed people have an increased risk of getting COVID. So the second study looked at data from over 470,000 people in a UK biobank, and about 15,000 tested positive for COVID. And they explored the risk of COVID, but in this case, they controlled for things like age, sex, education, and the presence of medical illness. They controlled for all the things that might in fact impact whether you got the illness, but they still found an increased risk of getting COVID if you had depression, 1.4 times, anxiety 1.4 times. But if you had both of them together, 1.7 times increased risk. The group that had the dramatically higher risk were those people with Alzheimer's dementia. So dementia in general was an increased risk factor. Unfortunately, what they didn't look at was people in congregate living environments and people who live in nursing homes and other retirement homes have a higher risk of getting the infection anyway. Nonetheless, clearly an increased risk of contracting COVID. Now, interesting enough, what I didn't tell you, what I didn't emphasize, is the fact that people with late life depression and late life anxiety are the ones that had the increased risk. People with depression and anxiety who were adults below the age of 65, who had onset before the age of 65, didn't seem to have a significantly higher rate. So the conclusion is that people with mental illness do seem more likely to contract COVID, and there may be many explanations. This is just a few. For example, there may be biological explanations. So, mental illnesses do have an effect on the immune system, and it's possible that if your immune system is impacted, you're more likely to get a COVID infection. There may be some impact of some of the treatments that people take on their immune system, and there is impact of age, particularly on immunity, which may explain some of the findings with dementia. There might be also some psychosocial reasons. For example, the impact of living circumstances, as I mentioned with dementia, the impact of illness, mental illness on a person's risk assessment, their capacity to make a judgment about whether they're going to be in a situation where they'll be at risk. And also it may be that people with mental illness have a higher relative importance of social interaction to maintain their well-being, and therefore are more socially active. These are multiple possibilities that have not yet been explored. The second question is, does depression or anxiety affect the outcome? So once you've already have COVID, is there a different outcome? And I'm not going to go through all the data. I'm just going to show you one study, and it's from the Wang study, the second Wang study. And what they did is they explored death as an outcome from COVID-19 infection and whether it was associated with mental health issues. And you can see on the right-hand side that if someone had depression, they were 1.6 times more likely to die as a result of COVID. Clearly, if they had dementia, they were 2.1 times more likely to die. If they had depression and anxiety, it was again around about 1.5 times more likely to die. So clearly, the conclusion is that mental health in general does not seem to affect the outcome of COVID-19, except in the case of depression, and especially when depression and anxiety coexist, and of course with dementia. And again, the same explanations. Why does depression and anxiety, and in this case dementia, lead to increased death? Again, I would have to say it's unknown. Does it have something to do with immunity and the fact that people with mental illness do have a sort of a lung-brain nexus, and they may have increased lung disease? Unknown at this point. The third question is, does COVID increase the risk of an episode of depression? In other words, there's something about COVID. We know that the virus gets into someone's brain. Does that increase the risk of depression and anxiety? And I'm going to give you the study, a study we did in Ontario, the COMO study, COVID Impact on Mental Health in Ontario. It was an observational, community-based cross-sectional study of over 2,500 Ontarians aged more than 18, and we took a sample that was provincially representative. And what you see here is in blue boxes, you see people who had no COVID infection. In orange, you see those who had tested positive for COVID, and you'll see that there was a 3.8 times increased risk of depression if someone tested positive for COVID, a 3 times increased risk of cannabis abuse, an 8 times increased risk of opioid abuse, almost a 2 times increased risk of alcohol misuse, and a 2.4 times increased risk of anxiety if you tested positive for COVID. And in fact, in the anxiety column there, it's almost all due to OCD, a dramatic increase in OCD and OCD symptoms in people who have tested positive for COVID. And this was after they had tested positive for COVID, not before. So we're just, actually, as we speak right now, we're in our third wave of the study, and we'll be able to see if these numbers hold true over the entire course of the pandemic. But clearly, people who have the illness appear to have increased risk of a variety of mental illnesses and addictions. The fourth question, does depression or anxiety affect people's willingness to receive vaccination? So this was a study we did in which we looked at, this was the second phase of the COMO study. We looked at people who were vaccine ready. That was 76% of the population at that point. That was January 2021, a year ago. 76% of people told us they were ready to take the vaccine, to get vaccinated. 15% were hesitant, so they weren't sure whether they were or they weren't. And 7% were resistant and absolutely refused to take it. And that's kind of interesting because a year later, about 7% of the population remains unvaccinated. And I suspect it's likely those people who declared to us they were not going to get vaccinated. Now, if a person was more likely to be ready to get vaccinated than hesitant if they were older, if they had higher socioeconomic status, if they were more anxious about contracting COVID, and they had higher depression scores. In other words, people were more ready to get a vaccine if they had more anxiety and depression, not if they had less anxiety. Or said the other way around, it's the hesitance was not in people who had depression and anxiety. The hesitance were in other people who had low depression and anxiety. The hesitance was in people who had high depression. The readiness were in people who were depressed or anxious. And same thing for ready versus resistant. So I may have confused you there. The point is that people with depression and anxiety are very ready to get vaccinated. Now, the final question, does depression or anxiety interact with people's burnout with the pandemic? Dr. Richter mentioned how exhausted and fatigued people are. And this was a study out of Germany in the early days of the pandemic, and they explored the role of social restrictions as part of COVID-19 pandemic in a sample of adults in Germany, over 4,000. And they found that the more restrictions due to lockdown measures, the greater the reduction in social contacts and the greater the perceived changes in life were all associated with higher mental health impairments. So the more we are asked to restrict our social activity and to restrict our activities in general, the more this impairs mental health, and particularly the stay-at-home order, even if it was a perceived stay-at-home order, was associated with poor mental health. So it is true, the longer we are asked to stay at home, it also adds to it, regardless of whether one has an infection with COVID or not, just the social restriction. But I want to conclude my presentation to talk about something else, because most surveys out there are asking people, how miserable have you been? How awful has this been? How terrible has this been? In the second wave of our survey, we actually asked people silver linings. What are the silver linings or the positive effects of the pandemic? And to our surprise, people told us there were. So for example, in this chart, you'll see the percentage of people in blue who told us they felt more of something, in orange, the same as prior to the pandemic, and in gray, they felt it less. And I'll just take out the same just to make this a bit easier to see. More people felt fortunate than did not feel fortunate. So over 2/3 of people felt fortunate, and less than 10% felt they weren't fortunate. More people felt healthy than less healthy. People felt more as physically strong as less physically strong. That didn't change much, and there was more people. There were people who felt both more and less. But people felt more resilient than less resilient, and more successful than less successful. And if you look at the numbers are in the 30, 40, 50, even higher, 60% of people saw a silver lining in the pandemic. And so to a certain extent, this is protective for a lot of people. Now, I will mention that if you look at all the people in gray, the people who felt less fortunate, less healthy, less physically strong, less resilient, less successful, there was a preponderance of people with depression and anxiety in that group. So depression and anxiety certainly colors the way we view the silver linings or not of the pandemic. So in conclusion, depression and anxiety increase the risk of contracting COVID. Depression and anxiety lead to worse outcomes to the infection. COVID infection may lead to increased risks of the episode of depression and anxiety. Depression and anxiety, however, tend to be associated with a higher likelihood someone will get vaccinated. Mandated and self-imposed social restrictions of the pandemic lead to increased depression and anxiety, but there also seems to be a large proportion of the population who had some positive impact on their psychological well-being during the course of the pandemic. And I leave you there and move on to our next presentation.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Really interesting story there. And just a reminder to everyone watching, we'll be conducting a question and answer discussion period and hope to answer your questions at that time. So please do continue to send us your questions through the sunnybrook.ca/speaker series. And maybe we can put that up in the chat. I'm wondering if somebody can put the link in the chat again. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Nathaniel Luckman. Nathaniel will be presenting on the topic of anxiety. What is it and what do we do about it? This talk will provide an overview on the description of anxiety, how to identify if you or a loved one is experiencing anxiety, and tips on how to manage anxiety. She'll also be providing an overview of evidence-based treatment available for anxiety, as well as some everyday strategies that people can engage in to help them manage it. And Nathania, I should have mentioned, is a staff occupational therapist with the Frederick W. Thompson Anxiety Disorders Center. So over to you, Nathania.
Thanks very much, Peggy. And good evening, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here.
Now we're seeing it.
All right. I hope everybody's okay.
Perfect.
Let me know if there's audio visual mishaps. All right, so thank you so much for the introduction. And like Dr. Victor mentioned, hopefully be able to help you identify what anxiety is and what we can possibly do about it. Okay, so outline for today, again, I thought we could go over just common descriptions of anxiety and identify when it becomes a problem. And then we'll go over some ways to cope with anxiety. We'll go over some description about psychotherapy, particularly cognitive behavior therapy, which is one of the evidence-based treatments available out there for anxiety, and some relaxation skills training, including deep breathing, visualization, and progressive relaxation. We'll end it with a list of resources that are available, and my understanding is that these resources and links would be available to all the viewers here. Okay, so without further ado, anxiety is, I believe, an emotion and an experience that all of us probably have become accustomed to over the past 2 years, whether we like it or not. Prior to this presentation, I was stuck in traffic for 3 hours trying to get home, and anxiety definitely came up driving during the storm. So we know that anxiety is something that all of us experiences. And we also know that anxiety is an adaptive emotion that occurs quite naturally in response to any kind of danger, threat. And most of you probably are familiar with the term fight, flight, freeze response, which is essentially what our nervous system responds with in the face of danger. So you might notice I have images of tiger and a bear and inclement weather. And it's this idea that when faced with true danger in front of us, our nervous system kicks us into this fight, flight, freeze, response, which allows us to be prepared to respond to this potential danger. If you encounter a bear in the woods, you would hope that your body would then divert all your resources towards being able to fight the bear or run away from the bear. And that would, the hope is then that would contribute to your survival in the face of danger. So it is experienced from everybody from time to time, and it does serve a very helpful purpose in our survival. Now, there are different ways that we experience anxiety, but there are common traits, I guess, across different situations when we do experience this sensation of anxiety. One of the first things that you may notice come up when you feel anxiety are the physical symptoms, right? And this might be in the form of an upset stomach. It might be muscle tension. It might be just kind of feeling tired. Or a big one that we probably notice a lot is our heart racing, which then often lead to more thoughts of dread, which we will go over in the next slide. Sometimes we have numbness and tingling in our hands or headaches, whatever that might be. A lot of times, these are the first things that we pay attention to because they are so uncomfortable, and they can be quite disturbing, really, interfering in our day. So for those of you who might wonder, why do I suddenly have this feeling? Maybe there is something that is being perceived as a danger. right? That is producing some sensations in your body. So the next symptom area of anxiety are thoughts. You may notice that when you are anxious, you're experiencing that feeling of anxiety, your thoughts may start to focus on your worst case scenario. So this might be overestimation of risks, those what if questions. And unfortunately, a lot of times these anxious thoughts actually make anxiety worse, right? When your mind starts thinking about, okay, what if this happens? You come up with that answer, and then your mind somehow is, creative enough to come up with more what if statements and what if questions to that answer that you had just come up with. And this is what happens when we then get pulled into kind of this anxiety cycle of thoughts, contributing to the physical sensations, which then pull you more into this cycle of thoughts. So as you can see, even these two areas of symptoms are now already starting to reinforce each other. So again, as we're talking about this, I want you to try to think about the most recent experience that you had with anxiety. It could be, again, weather related, it could be, work related, school related, whatever that might be. Try to kind of think about, how did I experience this just now, or an hour ago, or whatever that might be. So we know that our thoughts, or the way we interpret certain situations, can have a really big impact on how we feel and how we act. So these types of anxious thoughts will usually lead to more anxiety, which then typically leads us to engage in behaviors that may not be so helpful in helping us in the long term, but is useful in reducing the anxiety in the short term. Now, what happens is, by engaging in those activities, we are able to experience some sort of relief, which then encourage us to do more of those behaviors, which may not necessarily be helpful. So to give you an idea, again, some of these behaviors could be things like avoidance or withdrawal from certain activities that you anticipate will bring on anxiety. Quickest example, I hate going to the grocery store when it's crowded, because especially during COVID, I start wondering, well, who am I going to run into? Am I wearing my mask properly? Those kinds of questions come up in my mind, even though I know the rational answer. But maybe having these thoughts in my mind and having the feeling of anxiety make me want to avoid going to the grocery store. But that's not necessarily the most helpful behavior that I could engage in, because even though I may be able to avoid going to the grocery store and avoid experiencing anxiety in that moment, it doesn't help me have groceries in my fridge, which I need. So isolating from people is another thing that we need to. If we feel anxious about seeing people or going to gatherings, then we are going to isolate people. And that may lead to further feelings of anxiety, changing in appetite or sleep, feeling angry or irritable, which may result in us lashing out at people that we love. Because in that moment, we just feel so overwhelmed. These are all behaviors associated with anxiety that, again, we engage in that moment in the effort to reduce the anxiety, but is not necessarily helpful in the long run. Some of you right now might be able to even think about some examples that apply in your life, about some avoidance behaviors related to work, related to school, related to social engagement. And again, the reason we engage in these behaviors is because we may not necessarily have other tools on our hands to be able to handle the feeling of anxiety. So when does anxiety become a problem? We start to feel anxious about things we don't need to feel anxious about. That's really when we start to consider that maybe this is an issue, right? Because we know anxiety actually is helpful when we are faced with a certain danger. However, when we are starting to respond in this way to things that are not necessarily dangerous, when there is no actual threat, anxiety can become overwhelming and actually get in the way of daily functioning. For example, if our fight or flight response starts going off when there is no bear in front of you, and it starts going off when you are thinking about a bear coming up in front of you, you can imagine how maladaptive that can become and how interfering that can become when, you know, every time maybe you leave your door at your cottage, you think, oh my gosh, there could be a bear. What do I do? And you start focusing on how to confront a bear that's not technically in front of you. And that's when something we call the false alarm, right? The false alarm in our brain that starts to go off. And that's when anxiety becomes a problem. So what do we want to know? We want to see how can we cope with these feelings of anxiety in a more helpful way. One of the evidence-based treatment available out there is psychotherapy that many of you may be familiar with. And there are many different psychotherapy modalities available out there for anxiety. And this is just a list of some of them, including cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and some mindfulness-based interventions like mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based therapy, as well as compassion-focused therapy. And what I'd like to share with you a little bit more today is cognitive behavior. So CBT is essentially a form of psychotherapy which is structured, time-limited, problem-focused, and goal-oriented. What CBT does is it helps people to identify, question, and change how their thoughts, attitudes, and beliefs relate to the emotional and the behavioral reactions that cause them difficulty. So again, looking at some of the examples that we've seen so far, it's that idea that, okay, how can I actually pay attention to some of these thoughts and some of these feelings that came up in that moment and be aware of them? And maybe I can challenge them a little. What CBT teaches is, again, identifying some distortions in their thinking. You know, maybe I shouldn't think that a bear would just come at me anytime I step out of my cottage. And what are some of the ways you challenge that? Seeing your thoughts as ideas about what's going on rather than as facts, because we know that the mind is capable of producing a lot of thoughts, a lot of potential what ifs. And CBT also teaches us to stand back from the thinking that we're doing and consider situations from different viewpoints. And in that way, we're able to, again, challenge some of those thoughts that we have and the feelings that might be associated with those thoughts. And this is essentially CBT in a nutshell, right? So we start with the situation. What triggers a problem? In this particular diagram, it talks about being criticized at work. And then the first thing that comes up to our mind is the thought, I'm not good enough. And that eventually leads to your emotion of worthlessness, anxiety, fear, whatever that might be, leads us to the behavior of, okay, now what do I do? Okay, well, I'm going to avoid contact with others. I'm going to avoid contact with my manager because I really want to be criticized. And that might lead to, again, other physical reactions, getting tired, loss of appetite. And that would, again, just kind of takes you through this cycle. And the important part that I also want to point out in CBT is that we recognize these things don't move in one direction. We recognize that thoughts, emotions, behavior, physical reactions all interact with each other and produce reactions in each other. So there are some free online CBT resources available. And I am getting notice that I am cutting out a little bit. Maybe if I do this, I'm hoping that that's better. So I hope that you will just let me know. Sorry about this. Peggy, are you able to hear me okay?
It seems better now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'll keep it this way. Sorry about that. There are some free resources for CBT at this time that is available for residents of Ontario. Ability CBT and Mind Beacon. So this link is available up there for anyone to watch or to go through. And going over other ways to cope with anxiety. So there are some relaxation strategies that I'm hoping to be able to part everyone with today. And really the purpose of relaxation skills is to be able to help you reduce uncomfortable physical sensations from the fight or flight response. We know that those physical sensations can be a big motivator to engage in some of those unhelpful behaviors we talked about earlier. So being able to engage in relaxation skills hopefully will move you away from the more unhelpful behaviors. And the other goal is to be able to reach a state of relaxation, both in mind and in body. There are different types of relaxation skills available. Deep breathing, visualization, and progressive muscle relaxation are the three that I will briefly go over today. So deep breathing, we know that when we're anxious, we tend to breathe more rapidly and shallowly, which may increase the physical sensations of anxiety. And unfortunately, when we're trapped in that cycle, it can make it a lot scarier, and it may lead to some of the other areas, some of the other 4 areas that we went over about anxiety, and essentially kind of traps you in that cycle of anxiety. So what we want to try to do is engaging in deep breathing can allow us to reach that stage of relaxation by relaxing the muscles in your belly, slowing down your breathing, getting enough oxygen into your lungs, and just slowing down everything that is happening in your body, which we know tends to really rapidly increase, like your heart rate and your breath, during an anxiety response. Visualization, again, this is probably a strategy that many of us are familiar with. It really involves imagining a tranquil place or a safe place when we're feeling anxious, and really trying to engage all of your senses. So what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell, touch, or taste in this space that you are visualizing? So for some of us, it might be a forest, and for some of us, it might be a sunny beach somewhere in the world other than in GTA right now. Some of us may just picture our living room with a fireplace, whatever that might be. I usually recommend visualizing a place that you are really familiar with, because that way you can really, really engage all those senses, because it's a place that you have identified as safe, and it's a place that you are familiar with. You know exactly what it smells like, what you would hear, what you would smell, touch, or taste. So it is a really neat exercise that you can engage in really anywhere, as long as you have that in mind. Progressive muscle relaxation is, again, along the same lines of the visualization, except we are really engaging our bodies in the exercise. So when we're anxious, we know that our muscles tend to become really tight. We hold in tension in maybe more particular parts in our body. So progressive muscle relaxation tries to deliberately increase muscle tension and then releasing it to create a feeling of relaxation. And we do this in a progressive way, where we start from your toes and trying to increase muscle tension in the toes, and then releasing it, and then moving up to the ankle and the leg, and so on and so forth, and eventually going through your entire body with this deliberate tensioning of your muscles, and then releasing it. So some of the challenges that we run into when we talk about relaxation practice is, how do I make it a habit? How do I do it right? How do I even get into doing it? So we usually suggest setting specific times to practice relaxation techniques each day. Try to practice first when you're not as anxious, which will help you practice it more easily when you are, right? It's so hard to learn something new when you're anxious. Start small. Aim for 5 minutes to start. Even if in 2-minute relaxation exercise, that's still better than nothing. So starting that small chunk, and then considering practicing it a few times each day instead of practicing a huge chunk of time right away. So this is a little neat acronym that I came across recently, and I love that it really kind of reflects where we are right now, and kind of summarizes some of the things that we're talking about today in terms of how we want to face COVID, in the light of everything, and the fact that there is a lot of things right now that are out of our control. So start with F. F, focus on things that you can control, right? Focus on the things that matter to you. Focus on things around you that you can actually have control over. Acknowledge your thoughts and feeling. Be mindful about, what are some of these things that are coming up in my mind on a moment to moment basis? And what are some of the feelings that are emerging as a result of those thoughts? And sometimes not feeling like you have to do anything about it, and simply just acknowledging that, yeah, this is how I'm feeling and what I'm thinking. Coming back to your body. So engaging in some of those mindfulness exercises to be able to just notice what is happening in the body, noticing those physical reactions that come up during anxiety response. Engage in emotional first aid, again, bringing back those relaxation strategies, recognizing the emotions that are coming up, maybe the difficult emotions that are coming up, and then doing the things that actually help you to feel better in that moment, right? Doing the relaxation strategies that can help to provide that emotional first aid. Committing to practice self-care. Sometimes, maybe most times in the last 2 years, a lot of us have become engrossed in maybe caring for other people who need more care than yourself in that moment. And a lot of us forget to practice that self-care, as part of your day-to-day practice. And I think it's important to just be able to say, I am going to commit to practicing self-care even for 5 minutes today. Opening up to each other and treating everyone kindly, as we know it is hard right now with the reality that we're living in, and it's nice to not feel alone and support. Value these qualities of respect, appreciation, and courage. As we all know, we are all trying to value and recognize the courage in every single one of us in facing whatever it is that's happening in the world today. So recognize that and take the moment to just value that. Identify the resources that are available for help. So hopefully, again, some of the resources we listed here today is something that you can definitely look through and turn to. And developing a mental health plan. Again, simply maybe sitting down and outlining, okay, if I feel that way on this day, this is what I can do. This is who I can contact. These are the resources I can access. And just simply taking that time to be able to provide yourself with these extra resources and extra hands-on deck. So again, I hope that you find these helpful, and I hope that you can face COVID with some of these resources available. Again, this is just a list of resources of apps that are available out there, some box breathing, meditation exercises. There is a workbook over there as well that's listed, and some audio recordings that you can access. And these are some other more formal resources that have some infographics that you can access, some worksheets that you might want to look through with the help of a professional, or simply just learn more about anxiety and the intervention. I hope that's been helpful. And this is just a quick little comic that I thought is interesting as we consider some of these post-pandemic anxiety and post-pandemic anxiety thoughts that might come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathania. I'm sorry, I was laughing at that cartoon. It's a little bit too accurate for my liking. I'm hoping it isn't so accurate for everybody, but it felt pretty close to home. And so now I'd like to introduce our last speaker. Joanne Glowinski is a mental health clinician who works with the Frederick W. Thompson Anxiety Disorder Center. And it's a delight to have you tonight, Joanne. Joanne's going to be presenting techniques for maintaining wellness and building resiliency. So we've heard about some strategies around formal anxiety, and now Joanne's going to get into other things that enhance well-being for anybody and everybody, whether you have a formal anxiety disorder or not. And these strategies are things that can be practiced daily to boost mental health and prevent emotional overload. Thanks for being here tonight, Joanne.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Richter, for introducing me. My name is Joanne, and as Dr. Richter mentioned, I work with the Thompson Center in the residential program, and it is an honor to be here with you guys tonight.
Joanne, it's not in, oh, there we go.
Oh, we can see it now. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about how to maintain wellness. We're going to discuss different tips for protecting your mental health and helping you to build resiliency. Here is a brief agenda of what we're going to be reviewing today. We are going to discuss some different factors that contribute to our wellness, learn different strategies that we can begin to implement to help us feel better, and then we'll actually get a chance to review some specific techniques that we teach at the Thompson Center and in psychotherapy in general. Okay, so we'll start with a discussion about the main factors that contribute to our wellness. In therapy, we discuss something called vulnerability factors, and vulnerability factors are very important in order for us to achieve wellness. What vulnerability factors are things that set the stage for us to experience increased distress. So they're not necessarily the direct triggers of our distress. However, they are the things that set the stage for us to then become more anxious, more sad, more upset, or angry later on. As you can guess, the main three factors or vulnerability factors that contribute to our wellness are diet, sleep, and exercise. So I'm sure if I could see all of you guys and I asked for a raise of hands for those who felt that when they're more tired or they haven't had adequate exercise or they've been under eating or overeating, if they notice that that impacts their mental health and their well-being, I'm sure I would see a large number of you raising your hands right now. In psychotherapy, we tend to see these three as the biggest three vulnerability factors that really contribute to moments of distress. Before I move into tips, I just wanted to recommend that you please consult with your doctor prior to adopting any of these strategies, as they would be more aware of any health conditions that we would not have information about. We're going to start by talking about a diet. So when it comes to food, it's really important to eat small meals throughout the day. And this is because one of the biggest mistakes that we tend to fall into is eating too much, overeating, usually unhealthy food. I'm sure during COVID, lots of us are getting into our bags of chips and not realizing that what feels like a couple of chips in, the bag is already finished. So eating smaller meals throughout the day and multiple meals can really help us to curb those cravings and just help us to feel full throughout the day, so we're not getting into that overeating or undereating. Another great rule of thumb is to make your plate as colorful as possible. The more color, the better. And that's because vegetables and fruits are the most colorful of the food groups and should take up majority of our plate. And if your plate is quite colorful, it's really showing that you are trying your best to get in all the different food groups from Canada's Food Guide. And that's actually where we're going to be pulling a lot of these tips from today. So I have included a link here if you're interested in checking out some more tips from Canada's Food Guide, but here are some tips that are recommended. If you're someone that tends to drink lots of soda pop, whether that be Coke, Sprite, or something else, we recommend swapping that out for water or for tea. And if that sugar craving is still persistent, then having a whole fruit instead, or again, a tea that has some sort of fruitiness or sweetness to it, would be a healthier option. When it comes to carbohydrates, we don't want to eliminate them from our diet completely because they are important in providing us with energy, but there are some healthier options when it comes to carbohydrates. So simple carbohydrates or white carbohydrates are really the white starches that we know. So white bread, white rice, white pasta, those types of carbohydrates tend to make us feel quite sluggish throughout the day. And when we're feeling sluggish, we're much more likely to be in a bad mood. And so healthier carbohydrates that we recommend picking from are complex carbohydrates. So some examples of complex carbohydrates are sweet potatoes, and you'll see a whole bunch of whole grain food options here. So your whole grain rices, whole grain pasta, oatmeal, and different grains like that. When it comes to fat, same thing. We have our healthier fats versus our saturated fats. Some examples of saturated fats are potato chips, as mentioned earlier, French fries, those types of fried foods that seem to be quite doused in oil. And healthier fat options include olive oil, avocado, nuts, and seeds. When it comes to protein, you want to make sure you're filling up in protein, including it in every meal. This keeps our energy steady throughout the day. And when our energy is steady, so is our mood. So some good options for protein include lean meats, poultry, legumes, beans, and nuts as well. Fruits and vegetables, as mentioned earlier, should make up about 50% of your plate. And fruits and vegetables are really healthy and protect us against health risks. So try and fill up with fruits and veggies as best you can. And they also really help when you're having some sort of craving. If you're having a sweet craving, opt it for fruit. If you are having a crunchy craving, you can have a carrot or celery. It may not do the trick exactly, but it's a close one. And with caffeine, it's really important to limit our caffeine intake. As for those of you that do drink caffeine, you would know that it can sometimes cause us to feel jittery. And when we have that physical sensation going on in our body, we're much more likely to then feel anxious. So limiting your caffeine intake throughout the day, not just in cups of coffee, but also limiting chocolate intake and soda and other food or drinks that caffeine shows up in. Sleep. So most of us, again, if I asked for a show of hands for those of you who are sleep deprived, I'm sure I'd get a big show of hands right now. Most adults do tend to be sleep deprived, and it's recommended that adults get 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but most of us are getting less than this. We see lots of individuals in our programs who tend to undersleep or oversleep. And what we notice is that when they're undersleeping or oversleeping, the next day for them, their energy is quite thrown off and they're much more likely to be triggered by something and then experience some sort of distress. If you are one of these people who experiences this undersleeping or oversleeping, or perhaps just trouble falling asleep or even staying asleep, here are some tips for you to improve your sleep habits. Firstly, consistency is key. So you want to try to get to bed at the same time every day and wake up at the same time. We know that weekends, everyone likes to enjoy somewhat of a sleep in, but if there's quite a drastic difference between the time you're waking up on a weekend versus weekday, then that's really going to throw off that consistency and likely impact your mood. Drinking a lot or eating a lot before bed is not always the greatest decision, as it can leave us feeling full and uncomfortable, making it harder for us to fall asleep. As we discussed, caffeine can also really impact our mood, but also impact our ability to fall asleep since it is a stimulant. So as a result, you want to drink coffee or have any of your caffeine intake earlier in the day. So at least about 8 hours prior to bedtime. And if you are someone who can drink coffee right before bed, well, then you're a very lucky person, but not all of us are like that. And so we do recommend leaving about 8 hours in between the time that you have your last caffeine consumption and the time that you get to bed. Exercising daily. So exercise, you'll see next, is a vulnerability factor in and of itself. However, it also really impacts our sleep. The more our bodies are moving throughout the day, the more easily we're going to be able to fall asleep. Some studies also suggest that reducing the temperature of our bedroom can be helpful because that reduction in temperature mimics the reduction of temperature of our bodies when we're sleeping, which helps us to conserve energy, which as a result, that energy is going to impact our mood. Another tip that we recommend is only spending time in your bed when it is time to go to bed. So avoiding any time spent in the bed during the day. That's because when we do that, we are beginning to associate our bed with daytime. And we really want to limit that association with just nighttime. So try not to spend too much time in your bed throughout the day, leaving it only for nighttime so that it's easier for your brain to recognize that it's time now to go to sleep. A bedtime routine can make it a really lovely, a nice, lovely practice and relaxation practice to help us get to bed. And a bedtime routine can involve anything that works for you. If you're someone who enjoys taking a hot bath, that could be a really nice way to relax prior to hopping into bed. If you're someone who enjoys reading, that's a great bedtime routine. If you're someone who enjoys playing music, perhaps playing an instrument or listening to a relaxing playlist could be a nice thing to incorporate into your routine. screen use. So we want to avoid TV screens, phones, iPads, computers as much as we can, at least 30 minutes prior to bedtime. And that's because the blue light behind those screens actually shuts off the production of melatonin, which is our body's hormone that helps us to feel sleepy. So when that melatonin production is shut off, then our brain is tricked into thinking it's daytime, which is what's going to stimulate us and keep us awake. So we recommend at least giving yourself 30 minutes of no screen time prior to bed. And if you are having trouble falling asleep, don't panic. If you've been in bed for 20 minutes, the best thing you can actually do is get out of bed and do something outside the bed, whether that's reading somewhere downstairs or in another place of your home, doing some other activity to occupy yourself. That's because when we're sitting in bed, tossing and turning and really thinking about the fact that we can't sleep, it's likely going to turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy where we then have difficulty sleeping because of us dwelling on this thought so much. So if you notice you are having those types of thoughts, try and tell yourself that you're going to fall asleep eventually and it's okay. And you're likely going to have an easier time falling asleep. And for more sleep tips, you can check out the link that I've posted here. And the last vulnerability factor that we're going to discuss is exercise. On the right-hand side here, you can see just how exercise really impacts our happiness. When we exercise, we're reducing our body's levels of stress hormones, such as adrenaline and cortisol. Additionally, when we're exercising, our body produces chemicals that are called endorphins, which are also known as feel-good molecules. They've also even been called natural painkillers because the chemical helps us to reduce the perception of pain. Exercise also causes us to strengthen our muscles and our bones, which can then increase our self-esteem and our confidence, which then is also going to impact our happiness. Other benefits of exercise include better sleep, clearer thinking, improved mood, increased stamina and body strength, reduced symptoms of medical and mental health conditions, weight management, and improved energy. So all of these effects combined are a great recipe for wellness. Here are some specific tips that you can begin to implement. According to public health, we want to aim for at least 2.5 hours a week of exercise. However, keep in mind that this can be broken up into smaller chunks. So even just exercising for 10 minutes a day is a great place to start. And then you can exercise for an additional 10 minutes at another point in the day or perhaps the next day. So we want to aim for approximately 2.5 hours a week. But you also want to keep in mind where your starting point is. If you're someone who's exercising 0 minutes a week, then you would start lower than 2.5 and work your way up. The physical activities we're doing should range from moderate to vigorous. So a good rule of thumb, if you're not sure what each of those means, a moderate intensity exercise should increase your heart rate so much that it's possible to talk, but it's very difficult to sing. And vigorous intensity exercises should make it difficult to say more than even just a few words. You also want to find the physical activity that's right for you, whether it's swimming, walking, running, playing soccer, playing basketball, dancing, cycling, jumping rope. There are so many different activities out there, and the more you enjoy it, the more likely you are to keep practicing that activity. So it's really important to find something that you truly do enjoy. Many of us also sit at desks for extended periods of times. And if we don't, then we often are on the couch watching TV or doing something where we're really not moving. As a society, we are definitely living more sedentary lifestyles in general. And so limiting those sedentary behaviors, meaning how much you watch TV, how much you're sitting at a desk, can be really helpful. And even if you're sitting at your desk or sitting on the couch, just moving a little bit there can be a great place to start too. We recommend moving as much as possible. When you can, try not to take the bus or public transportation or your car and walk instead, if possible. Not in today's weather though, so if that's the case, stay put today. It's cold out there. Making a specific goal and plan is also really important. I always say to my clients, if I set a goal to exercise more versus the goal to exercise on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 3:30 to 4 o'clock, which one am I more likely to meet? I'm obviously much more likely to meet the latter because it's a very specific, measurable, and achievable plan. It's quite realistic, and it's really laid out for me exactly when I'm going to be exercising or what I'm going to be doing. I'm much more likely to follow through with a plan like that as opposed to a vague plan such as getting more exercise. And as mentioned earlier, start somewhere. Everyone has to start somewhere, and be kind to yourself if you aren't where you want to be right now. It is a pandemic. We are all struggling, and we really need to be kind to ourselves. Our routines have completely changed during this pandemic. And so starting anywhere, even just for 5 or 10 minutes a day, is still a start. The next skill I'm going to be introducing to you is from a type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT for short. And DBT is a type of therapy that's supposed to that teaches healthier strategies for managing complex emotions. So ABC is one DBT skill, and these are types of skills that you can practice every single day. The goal of these skills is to practice them so much so that they act as a buffer for negative situations, which we all know are an inevitable part of life. So I'm going to walk you through what each letter stands for, one at a time, and then we'll get to practice some skills. So the A in ABC stands for accumulating positive experiences. So on the board here, I have posted a whole bunch of different pleasant activities, some which you may have already engaged in, some which maybe you previously engaged in and have recently stopped. But nevertheless, here are a whole bunch of activities, and I'm sure you could come up with many, many more. And the idea is that we want to fill our days with as many of these activities as possible. Some activities might be kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. For example, a best friend's wedding, or maybe your favorite artist is having a concert and you're attending that concert. Those activities might be a 10 out of 10, kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. But some of the ones here are more 1 out of 10s or 2s out of 10s or 3s out of 10s. So things that still make us feel pleasant, they still bring us some sense of joy and happiness, but perhaps they're not as grand or as important or big as some of the other ones. Nevertheless, you still want to fill your day with as many as even the 1 out of 10 pleasant activities as possible to act as a buffer for those negative stressors. The B in ABC stands for building mastery. And building mastery is not so much about doing enjoyable activities, but it's more so about doing productive activities. And that's because when we do productive activities, we tend to feel quite accomplished afterwards. And it's a really nice feeling that can often last for quite a bit. So building mastery may involve building a new skill, perhaps building a skill in something you were previously good at and maybe you've kind of fallen off the wagon with. Maybe you used to play an instrument and you're wanting to pick that up again. It could be for students doing homework because that makes them feel accomplished and like they've achieved something. It could also mean crossing something off your to-do list. Often we have these long outstanding to-do lists, and it can feel really daunting to approach any of those tasks. So even just crossing one thing off, whether it be as small as responding to an email you haven't been able to get back to, or it could be something really big, like if you're moving homes per se, and you need to start packing up your home box by box, that could be considered a mastery activity. So getting in a good combination of those enjoyable and productive activities is a really good recipe for improved mood. Lastly, the C in ABC stands for coping ahead. Coping ahead is a skill that we teach in psychotherapy that helps a person identify an upcoming stressful situation that is coming. So perhaps you are going to start a new job on Monday. And so that's something you can predict that you know is likely going to come with some feelings of anxiety, some fear, perhaps some embarrassment. And so that is a great situation to use for a strategy like this. Unfortunately, we can't always predict when a negative stressor is going to arise, but in any case, when we can, you want to use a strategy like this. So part of it is identifying the emotion that you think that you're going to experience. So if I know I'm starting a new job on Monday, I know that I'm likely going to feel anxiety. The next thing you want to then do is identify the different strategies that you plan on using when you're experiencing that distress. So I know for me that when I feel anxious, listening to soothing music can be really helpful, and practicing progressive muscle relaxation that Nathaniel recently presented to you guys is also quite helpful. So I'm going to keep those skills in my metaphorical back pocket, and I'm going to use them when I'm experiencing anxiety. The next thing you want to do is identify any challenges that may arise in practicing that skill. So perhaps I'm practicing that skill, but then someone comes to get me and tells me that I have a meeting. So now I have to figure out a way to cope with that obstacle that I didn't quite predict. And then part of coping ahead is then actually closing your eyes, imagining yourself in that stressful situation right now in this moment, imagining what you see around you, what you feel, what you smell, what you taste, really envisioning all your senses and what's going on around you. And then mentally rehearsing, going through those skills that you're going to use to cope. So for me, I might close my eyes and envision putting my AirPods in and finding my favorite soothing playlist and turning it on. I also want to practice how I'm going to overcome obstacles. So for example, perhaps being interrupted is going to be an obstacle. I want to practice how I'm going to cope with that. Perhaps I'm going to take my headphones out and I'm going to look at the person speaking with me, and so on and so forth. So coping ahead is a great skill to use if you are going into a situation that you can predict is going to be stressful. I'm going to briefly talk about mindfulness as well. Mindfulness, lots of studies have shown the effects of mindfulness, and these include increased awareness, as well as improved mood, reductions in anxiety and depression. So mindfulness is a big part of treatment for both our program at the Thompson Center, but many treatment programs are really incorporating mindfulness strategies into their programs as well. And mindfulness means observing your internal and external surroundings, paying attention to those things with curiosity. So not with judgment. So noticing just what's going on around you, what you can smell, what you can see, what you can hear, what you can touch, what's going on internally, what thoughts are coming up, what feelings are coming up, what physical sensations are arising, and doing this without judging. So if I'm noticing that I have a sensation in my stomach, if I'm practicing mindfulness, I'm not going to say that this pain is horrible and I can't bear it. Instead, I might say there is a sensation in my stomach and it feels as though it's making circles to the left. And so part of mindfulness is really just staying in the present moment and noticing those things in a non-judgmental way. There are 4 key components of mindfulness. So it starts with observation, which really comes through our senses. So using those senses of sight, smell, touch, and sound to tune into our environment, what's going on around us, and what's going on internally, and just noticing those things. The next part is describing. So describing all of those things, what's going on internally and externally, our physical sensations, our emotions, our thoughts, without labeling them and without evaluating them. So really just objectively and descriptively describing them, just as I gave that example about the stomach ache. Participating fully means really noticing the experience as it happens, and really just allowing yourself to kind of dive into that experience, not having anything hold you back. So not being distracted or preoccupied at that time, really trying your best to stay in that moment and notice if your mind does drift, doing whatever you can to bring your mind back. And then one of the most important parts is maintaining that non-judgmental stance. So accepting anything that comes as it is. So even if it's negative emotions arising, if you're feeling anger showing up, if you're noticing really, really distressing thoughts, just accepting those for what they are, noticing that they're there, but not necessarily doing anything to get rid of it, to make it go away, or to make it easier, or to even just judge it as wrong or bad or right or good. we're gonna finish off with a mindfulness practice, but I'm actually gonna change things up here. I was going to do a breathing exercise, but instead I'd like to do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is a really great introduction to mindfulness since it incorporates all of these actually: observing, describing, participating fully, and being non-judgmental. So wherever you are right now, if you're comfortable closing your eyes, please do so. And if you're uncomfortable closing your eyes, find a spot on the floor where you can gaze at. Find a comfortable position. You want to be alert yet relaxed at the same time. So the first thing you want to do is notice 5 things around you. So if your eyes are closed for this part of the exercise, open your eyes and look for 5 things around you. Descriptively describe them either aloud or in your head. Describe the different shapes that you see, the different colors that you see. Perhaps there are different shades of the same color or of different colors. Pick 5 objects and objectively and descriptively describe what you see. Once you've done that, find 4 things that you can feel. Perhaps it's the feeling beneath your seat, the texture of the arms of the chair that your arms are resting on. Perhaps you have a fuzzy blanket on top of you. Or perhaps you're sitting next to a pet. Descriptively, in your mind or aloud, describe the texture and the sensations that you are feeling. Describe any sensations of warmth. Perhaps you're feeling cool. Just noticing 4 different sensations that you can feel. Next, pick 3 things that you can hear. Perhaps the sound of my voice, a buzzing of your air conditioning or heat, hopefully, or your computer charging. Perhaps there's noise coming from the streets that you can hear from outdoors. Pick 3 things that you can hear and just objectively describe them. Next, pick 2 things that you can smell. Maybe there's dinner cooking up. Perhaps you don't smell anything and the smell is a smell of nothingness. Perhaps it's the smell of your shampoo or your laundry detergent. Notice if you have the urge to judge that smell as being good or bad or pleasant or unpleasant. And just notice that judgment, letting it drift on by, coming back to what you're noticing. And lastly, notice 1 thing that you can taste. Again, this might be the taste of nothingness. Perhaps it's the lingering taste of coffee, tea, a mint, gum, the last thing you ate. And just notice what it's like to taste that, where in your mouth that taste appears. And again, if you're noticing any judgments, labeling it as pleasant or unpleasant, just notice that too, and come back to the taste. We'll finish off with 1 big deep breath. So inhaling through our nose and exhaling out of our mouths. You have just completed a mindfulness practice called 5-4-3-2-1, a great introduction to mindfulness and a great strategy you can use either when feeling calm or when feeling anxious, or just a great way to be present and bring yourself back to the present moment if you're feeling a little bit caught up in your thoughts. And I just wanted to share some resources as well. A lot of overlap with Nathania's resources too. So Headspace or Calm are really great mindfulness apps. There is a workbook here as well and some other resources that could provide some more information about anxiety, mental health, and wellness in general. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Joe. That was great. And hopefully people have sat and tried to do some of that mindfulness and are feeling maybe in a better space now than they were when they started. So that concludes our formal presentations for the evening. And now we're going to do some question and answer. And we have a fair amount of time, hopefully, to get through most of the questions. In the chat, I have posted the website again for anybody who is holding on to a last question or two and wants to send them in. So you can find that on the chat. And we'll be going through those that were sent in advance or that come in now. So thanks everybody for great talks. And we have questions on a wide range of topics. They do tend to group together though, and a number of them, there were actually a few questions, and I'm going to direct to Anthony Levitt first, maybe around navigating healthcare services. So there was a question sent in by someone who says they have teens struggling with significant anxiety or depression, that they're finding the system too slow to meet their needs. It's hard to access psychotherapy, and everybody is feeling frustrated. So they're wondering about strategies a parent can implement. Well, I'm asking two things. Like one question is, what are resources to find help for teens? And maybe then I'll come back to the second part of the question.
Okay, so, you know, prior to the pandemic, we would have had very similar comments that people were finding it difficult to find resources, that the resources were slow to react. But I can tell you, since the pandemic began, this has escalated manyfold. We have a tsunami of mental health issues amongst our youth, particularly in the anxiety area and in depression. And resources are strapped. However, I should mention this. A lot of people complain that the mental health system, mental health and addiction system is like a big dark room. There's not enough lights showing us the way. But actually, there are plenty of lights. We just don't know where the light switches are. And that is to say, there are lots of resources out there, more than you would imagine. And there are some resources that can help you find them. So there are websites. The government has a website called Connex Ontario, CONNEX, and you can put your details of what you like into that. There are some limitations, and that's only publicly funded resources. There's a group called the Family Navigation Project at Sunnybrook, where I work. The Family Navigation Project, if you just put Family Navigation into Google, it's the first thing that comes up, and that's a number you can call to help find resources. And what we do there is we keep our finger on the pulse of all the resources, public and private. What's happened during the pandemic is people really want face-to-face help. If we ask people, what would you like in the pandemic? People say, I want face-to-face help, and it's often not available. And so that's a shame. However, what's happened is an explosion of virtual resources. And virtual resources are still available. There isn't as much of a wait time. There are some that are publicly funded. Vast majority are privately funded, but some are relatively inexpensive and very accessible. And the only caveat I would have is if your youth has anxiety and issues with overuse of technology and overuse of the internet, it's not necessarily the best way to get treatment for internet issues over the internet itself, but they are very available. These virtual resources are excellent, and they're a great stopgap until we can move back towards more face-to-face treatment.
Thanks so much, Anthony. That's great. And I've taken the liberty of typing a few of those into the chat, so feel free to add to them. The other part of the question, I think, which although it pertains to teens, came up a lot for many people, was what strategies a parent can implement at home and on a daily basis to help their teen and the rest of the family cope while maybe waiting for services, or if they're not engaging with services. So I think they're looking for home-based suggestions for dealing with anxiety and depression. And of course, we've heard several talks about this, but I'm just wondering if anybody wants to address this again.
I'm happy for Nathaniel or Joanne to respond to this, because I think there are many of the strategies they mentioned that you can do on an individual basis are also available to parents. But I'll just jump in and say one thing, and that is that we are not great at dealing with our own anxiety. Anxiety is often an unpleasant experience and we want to avoid it. And I think you've been given strategies for not avoiding it, but actually dealing with it. And we find it noxious, not only ourselves, we find it noxious in our children. And so it's very hard to want to deal with it. There are people, and I'm not going to talk about the simple, low-cost resources that I hopefully Nathania and Joanne will, but there are folks out there who are parent coaches. It's a designation. A lot of people put up their shingle and say they're parent coaches, but there are really excellent parent coaches out there who help to give parents strategies in dealing with their own and their youth's anxiety. And sometimes it's really important that parents sort of have these strategies and tactics and feel comfortable with them so they can help their youth. There are publicly funded and privately funded resources. And although there is a bit of a wait in the publicly funded area, it's not as bad as you would think. And there are groups and individual options out there.
Thanks, Anthony. Does somebody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I just want to kind of piggyback on Anthony's comments there. I think one of the things that we've noticed is, unpleasant emotions, as unpleasant as it is in us, it's also unpleasant when we see it in others. And our natural human instinct is to want to help get rid of it as quickly as possible. And sometimes, unfortunately, the first reaction that we jump to may not necessarily be the most helpful in the long run. So, all the relaxation strategies and mindfulness exercises that we went over today, those are things you can practice yourself, but also perhaps with some of the teenagers that you have. Now, I can say, teenagers may not be as open to practicing this with their parents, but I wonder if maybe increasing your own capacity to be able to tolerate some of the uncomfortable emotions by practicing some of these strategies may help you to also be able to help your child and teenagers to maybe deal with some of their own anxieties by doing these exercises together. I mean, there are, again, organizations out there, local organizations that are maybe more relevant in specific areas. I'm in Durham, so, there's Durham Children's Mental Health that they can connect with, and they are running some group programs from what I understand. And again, unfortunately, right now, everything's being run virtually, and they may not be something that teenagers really want to do more of, especially having gone through all the online schooling these past few years. But it is nevertheless a resource that is available. So I might sound like a broken record when I say this, but we do say this a lot of times, practice does sometimes help to achieve not necessarily perfection, but comfort in terms of your ability to do some of these strategies, right? And the hope is if it becomes maybe more of a habit in your day-to-day to practice some of these strategies, it may very well become part of your kind of just routine on a daily basis.
Thanks, Nathania. One thing I wanted to add in, and maybe this is going a little too far, but often when dealing with teens who are themselves struggling with mood and anxiety issues, it is really easy to be feeling overwhelmed as a parent. And so it does remind me of what you do on an airplane when the airbags drop. You need to put on your own first, right? You need to always look after yourself as a caregiver. Because if you are now caught up in a cycle of feeling desperate and stressed by your teens, and overwhelmed yourself, you're going to be reacting in the moment and probably not helping them as well as you might if you were yourself in a more resilient state of mind. So thinking about some of these strategies we talked about today for maintaining your own wellness might also be really important as another consideration. Okay, let me go to another group of questions. There were a lot of questions about people feeling stuck at home and feeling anxiety about going out. So let me take up a few of these and let's try and answer some of them. So one person said, how do we deal with living alone, first of all, and not being able to go out socially? Any suggestions or strategies? You want to take that one up? Jo?
I'll take this one, sure. So I think the pleasant activities that I spoke about in my presentation are really important. And whether those are social activities that we're doing with others, with family members, or doing it by ourselves, I think either way are really important for our mood and to stabilize our mood. And I think if you're living alone, connecting socially is still really important, even if that's only happening virtually right now. It's unfortunate that we aren't really able to see all of our loved ones in person. However, social connection is still so important for us and for improving our wellness, maintaining our wellness. So it's really important to keep those connections strong, FaceTiming your friends, calling people, texting people, just really keeping those ties.
Does anybody else have anything to add? There's thoughts. Because I might add, thinking about basic things that you can do is really important at a time like this. We may not be able to get together inside with people, but can you meet friends in front of their driveway? Can you meet at a park or go for a walk together? I know there was a question similar to this about seniors who may find it even harder to get outside. But maybe something to think about is, are there people in your life who you can lean on who would help you to go outdoors somewhere to get some fresh air? And using the technology that you do feel comfortable with, whatever it may be, to connect with loved people in your life is so important. I've also heard some recommend going back to writing letters, snail mail, interestingly. And I think many of us have lost track of how that used to be a really helpful way for reflection and actually maybe more conducive to sharing one's deeper feelings. And so I have heard some advocate, starting up a letter exchange might be another interesting idea. So I think we all have to get creative. This is a tough time for everyone that way. Maybe a somewhat related question was, I used to get exercise by doing activities like walking to the store and doing day-to-day things. Now I don't leave home unless I need groceries. How can I motivate myself to be active without leaving home?
I can jump in a bit, and then maybe Jo and Anthony can jump in as well. But I think this kind of ties back to the section when we're talking about how when we experience unpleasant anxiety, we may want to avoid doing certain things that could technically be helpful for us. So I think your question on motivation is a big one. I think a lot of us are probably feeling a lack of motivation these days because of whatever it is that we're going through. So I think being able to even just take the time to recognize like what is going through my mind right now, maybe recognizing the thoughts that are coming up that might be reducing your motivation in that moment. What kind of feelings are coming up in that moment for you? What kind of emotions? What kind of physical reactions are actually coming up in that moment? And that might actually help you to recognize, okay, so in this moment, I'm worrying about something that has nothing to do with whatever it is that I want. And then being able to create maybe a more concrete plan about, okay, how can I commit myself to, exercising even for 10 minutes today at this time, kind of like what Joanne was saying earlier. It's a lot easier to make something happen when you are making that very concrete timeline and that very specific goal in terms of when and where that's going to happen and how. And I would go as far as making a plan in terms of what do you need to do before you make that happen. So if it's exercising outside, maybe taking a walk in the winter, that means you got to get your snow boots ready and make it very accessible. You got to get your exercise clothes ready and out there and visible for you to grab, so that what you want to do is essentially try to remove as many obstacles that you can remove ahead of time, so that when it comes time for you to actually engage in that activity that is helpful, you have less amount of obstacles or less tangible obstacles that are present.
Thanks, Nathania. Anybody else want to drop in?
I'm gonna add a small comment here. I went down the other day to the basement to get some supply, and my daughter was stretching and moving and looking at her phone. I thought, well, that's an odd thing to be doing, but she was actually following a yoga instructor, and it was actually a free online service. So, I think Nathania is talking about issues of motivation, which are very important, the psychological aspect. And the other part of it is access. We feel like we don't have access, but actually there is access to a variety of online and other resources that are actually she looked like she's having fun to me anyway.
Maybe I can throw in a few of my favorite tips for building motivation, which are, one is to build in rewards, particularly if it's something that isn't inherently fun or pleasurable to you. So around exercise, for example, I talk to people about doing things like listening to a talking book while they're walking. If you have some kind of equipment in the house, can you watch your favorite TV show, but only while you're on your treadmill? So I have a rule that I had to make for myself, which is really tough at times, which is I only allow myself to binge watch my favorite TV shows while I'm on my treadmill. I do not let myself sit down. When I'm ready to get off the treadmill, the TV show goes off. And if I want to find out more about what happened, or if I'm watching a movie serially over several days, it means I'm back on the treadmill. But talking books might be another option, depending on what your activity may be. Or allowing yourself to schedule the pleasant reward right after the activity you need to do. Maybe it's something as simple as washing the dishes and doing some housekeeping, while setting up a tangible goal, a specific time, and saying, after I complete that, I'm going to allow myself to have that treat I want, or to call my friend, or to watch that TV show you want to watch, or whatever, read my book for half an hour. So allowing yourself to look forward to those rewards for completing the activity is really helpful. And another technique is setting it up with a buddy. If there is someone in your life who you can make a commitment to about that activity, most of us are much more likely to follow through, because we know that other person will ask us how it went, and we don't really want to have to say we didn't do it. So that's another idea I would share. Okay. We know sleep is important for health. I eat well and exercise, but some nights I still have trouble sleeping. This person says they have tried sleeping pills, but didn't find it helpful. And they're asking about other suggestions for sleep. I'm wondering, maybe Anthony, do you want to take this one first, from a medical perspective?
Yes, it's okay. Sorry, can you repeat that?
So looking for tips, I think, for sleep when sleeping pills didn't seem to help. Somebody who is eating well and exercising. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I mean, we had a great review on how to improve sleep hygiene earlier. And I was actually, when I was watching it, I was thinking to myself, I hope people are writing this down, because it was such a great series of tips and presented in a great order. So there are some really important things to do for sleep hygiene. But let me talk about the possibility of how one deals with sleep if you have anxiety or depression, because that becomes a different kettle of fish. On a regular, everyday basis, sleep hygiene is important. Even if you have depression, anxiety, sleep hygiene we shouldn't forget about it. But there are a variety of options and medications and treatments available that aren't your routine and regular treatments. That can be provided by going to see a family doctor or by a specialist consult. And I wouldn't give up on medications altogether. There are a variety of options. We all prefer sleep hygiene, and we all prefer simple, reproducible, sustainable options. And those are mostly the ones we mentioned earlier with sleep hygiene. But if it does require medications, then there are medications out there, and there is a wider variety than you would imagine.
And I'm wondering, Joe, can I turn it over to you to just maybe briefly, maybe reiterate what you think are the core strategies?
Yeah, I can kind of sum up that slide. So consistency is really important. So maintaining a consistent sleep and waking schedule. For those of us that tend to, go to bed earlier on weekdays and then sleep in quite a lot on weekends, even just those few hours can really throw off our entire schedule. So making it as consistent as possible. I think having a bedtime routine, although it sounds a little bit childish to some degree, is really important. And it's all about just getting into that mindset for you. Whatever you notice relaxes you, and that's really going to change from person to person. If it's drawing for you, wonderful, let's take out a sketchbook and some pencils. If it's music for you, let's take out your headphones. So finding something that really does calm you down and help you to relax is a really great strategy. I think also the mindfulness that I introduced to can even just begin to help you identify any particular thoughts that might be interfering with sleep. What we tend to notice is a lot of people have negative thoughts about sleep. So if you're getting into bed while thinking, there's no way I'm going to fall asleep tonight, well, then it's probably going to be pretty hard to fall asleep if you're constantly reviewing that thought over and over. So using the mindfulness skills just to help you even identify, am I having a thought right now that could be that I'm getting stuck on, that could be interfering with me actually falling asleep? And perhaps noticing all the other sensations going on, and maybe that will help to kind of drown out the noise of that thought.
Thanks so much, Joe. And also a reminder, in the slides, I think we shared a few apps which have lots of free materials. One of those apps, for example, is something called Calm, C-A-L-M, and they have lots of free material, much of it aimed towards helping people sleep. And that would include mindfulness scripts. I think progressive muscle relaxation is in there. Some DBT skills like Joe mentioned, and a variety of things. So that would be another good option. Okay, another question. I'm a naturally anxious person. I follow protocols to protect myself during the pandemic, like wearing masks and following the rules. But when I'm out amongst too many people in public, my anxiety is still extra high. What can I do?
This goes to, I think it was Nathania who was saying that there are some things to be anxious about. Like the appropriate anxiety is actually an early warning device. Now, it is true that some people's early warning device fires maybe in the wrong situations. And I think that it's okay to be compassionate towards oneself. Almost to say, thank you, early warning device, for trying to warn me about this. I appreciate you have an eye out for me. I don't need it right now because I'm going to do something that's of low risk to me. But thank you anyway for giving me that warning. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't want to throw out that early warning device because you need it when you're really anxious. But it's okay to talk to yourself and thank yourself for being alert and on the lookout, but saying, I don't really need that right now because I know this is a safe environment, but thanks anyway. That's based on a therapy called compassion-focused therapy, came out of the UK and started with the treatment of schizophrenia, but it's just as appropriate for anxiety as well. But I yield the balance of my time to the.
That's lovely. Nathania, did you want to look like you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I would say, I think, we all need a little bit more compassion. We use more compassion these days. And sometimes we forget because sometimes we go into this mode of, I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to accomplish this and that. And we forget to kind of just be kind to ourselves and sometimes say, okay, thank you, mind, for reminding me that this could be a danger, right? without necessarily doing exactly what the mind or the body wants you to do in that moment, to say, thank you, mind, for alerting me, like Anthony said, but right now I kind of need to do this. This is what I'm doing. And I think it's interesting because sometimes we don't really hear about engaging with our thoughts in this way, but it might help to be able to create, that distance from your thought and be able to interact with your thought in a different way. And I'm actually touching on a different therapy technique called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is also, kind of like an extension of CBT is the way I see it, because it incorporates a lot of the CBT techniques we talked about earlier about, challenging and identifying the thoughts that you might have, and then pairing it with some mindfulness strategies and exercises and concepts to be able to just simply allow your thoughts to be thoughts, right? And be able to recognize that, yes, I'm having these thoughts, but I am not necessarily my thoughts. You can even take a step and add the phrase, I am having the thought that, this may happen. But that would hopefully allow you to give yourself that moment of recognition that, oh, this is a thought. This is not happening right now, but I am having this thought. Yes, that's true. And that's okay. You can do it with feelings as well. You can say, I am having the feeling of anxiety or whatever that might be. But hopefully that would help you to kind of distance yourself from that scary, anxious feeling.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to throw in one other little bit, which is at a more pragmatic kind of day-to-day level. If you're finding that going back out and re-entering the world is just too scary after being shut in for so long, you can use a technique that we use all the time in treatment of anxiety disorders, which is something that we often call behavior therapy. We're learning to challenge our problematic behaviors, and this can be done in a really stepwise way. So if being around a lot of people with masks on right now is just very anxiety provoking, can you start re-entering the world in little steps? Are there places where you're maybe not completely comfortable, but less fearful? Maybe it's on more crowded sidewalks as a starting point where there are more people around, but you're still, outside in the fresh air. Maybe it's going into a relatively uncrowded corner store where you may not encounter too many people as another, or going in off hours to a grocery store when there are very few people around. And only gradually do you push yourself to really re-enter those really high anxiety situations, perhaps going into grocery stores during busy times if you must. So that would be another example of a step-by-step strategy that could be tried. Okay, let's see. I have a question here about, this is an interesting one, the difference between lethargy, boredom, feeling tired, and being depressed. So the differences between lethargy, boredom, feeling tired, and depressed. And this is written by someone who says during these 2 years of COVID, they are often feeling like they've been in a slump. Movement or action has helped, but it was trickier when they lost some motivation. Now they comment that they are usually an optimistic person, but are still wondering, how do you distinguish between those different states? I don't know, any thoughts, Anthony?
Well, they're all interconnected, and often when I'm talking to someone with depression, and I ask them the question, "How has your energy been? Your physical energy?" And I'm interested in, are they tired? Are they fatigued? And I'll come back to those symptoms in a second. People tell me about their concentration, and they tell me about their motivation, because we all jumble them together. So concentration is your capacity to focus on a task until it's completed to your satisfaction. Energy is the physical energy, is tiredness or fatigue. So and tiredness and fatigue is two separate things. Tiredness is feeling when you're not doing anything, like you are sleepy, or you have no energy, or that you feel spent. Fatigue is when you actually do something, and you get tired way too early. Some people tell me they get tired taking out the garbage that shouldn't ordinarily make them fatigued. Motivation is several aspects. It's the degree to which you are looking forward to something, your capacity to initiate something you enjoy, the level of enjoyment you have, your capacity to complete the task, and then your capacity to feel satisfied after completing the task. But those are all intertwined with your capacity to concentrate and your energy. But think of it as playing tennis, or, I generally like to play tennis. I have a background desire to play it. I can initiate it. I can complete the task. When I complete the task, I enjoy it. So those are motivations. So I think the first thing is to understand what these terms mean. Boredom, lack of interest, fatigue are different things. Once you kind of establish these are different things, the question is, how much are these interfering with your daily function? And how persistent have they been? Are they there all day, every day? Are they there for an hour or two, a few days in a row, but then they're fine? The real issue is, if you are fatigued or tired or you've lost motivation, and it's there almost every day and almost all day for a week or two at a time, that means something. That's not just, oh, I'm like that because we're all shut in because of the pandemic. Actually, it's not true that we're all like that we have it virtually all day, virtually every day. So if it's persistent and consistent, you really need to have an evaluation. You could have a medical condition like anemia or thyroid illness, or you could have depression or anxiety, because these conditions also rob us of focus, concentration, energy, etc. So I think if you can identify what you're going through, and sometimes it's helpful to go online. There are some great resources online where you can take a self-test to see if you have, that helps you to distinguish these symptoms, and then ask yourself, are they there consistently and persistently? And if they are, I think it's helpful to have an assessment.
Another question about seniors, which comes from someone asking about resources for enhancing mental health and wellness of currently homebound seniors who may have limited English proficiency. So they're wondering about resources around mental health and wellness during the pandemic. Any suggestions anybody might be able to make specifically?
I don't have any off the top of my head right now, but I do know that there are some cultural centers who do offer services for seniors. Of course, homebound seniors would make it a lot more challenging right now to attend some of these events, or maybe even attending them virtually, as technology may not be as accessible to them. But I could certainly look into some of the resources in at least the GTA. I know there are some cultural centers that do provide kind of more culture specific, I guess, services in the language that they're comfortable. I'm not sure this particular question.
Sorry, Nathan, you're cutting.
Am I cutting out?
Yeah, maybe if you could sit still. I think when you move, it's worse. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I was just saying I can look into the resources and maybe post it for whoever will be posting the information. I'm not sure what specific culture or language the senior that presented the question is of, but I can certainly list a few.
Yeah, there's a website to check out, Sprint, S-P-R-I-N-T, Sprint, that's in North Toronto, and there are similar agencies in various other areas across the city. And on Sprint's website, they have sort of some of the collaborative partnerships they're involved in, and there's a whole list of agencies. To a certain degree, it's going to take navigation. And navigation means persistence. And if you persist, you will go through those resources, and you'll speak to one, or you email or text one, and they'll tell you others. And eventually you will find a remarkable plethora of resources that we have in certainly GTA and also across Ontario. And because of the pandemic, even though it's a terrible thing we're going through, it's also a wonderful thing because most of these are now available online. It's much easier to communicate with them and find out about them. So I would just start at one place like Sprint if you're in North Toronto, or an equivalent for your region, and check out their website, and you'll find connections.
I was also going to say talking to your family doctor may always be a good way to start. Presumably your family doctor is able to communicate with you in your language and may know of some resources specific to people with your language. So that would be another good way to get connected. And as Nathania said, if there's a cultural center for your community, whatever it may be, they may also be able to help navigate. So those are tough ones though. And then we have somebody asking whether anger and temper outbursts are part of depression in the context of an adult male.
I can take a start anyway. That's a really good question, and we get it all the time. You know, one of the main symptoms of depression, and it's true at adolescent and in advanced age, but also across the lifespan, people don't realize is irritability is a symptom of depression. And irritability can be expressed as outbursts of anger, for sure. But for it to be depression, it can't be the only symptom. One has to be accompanied by other symptoms, and it has to be persistent and consistent. Someone who has outbursts of irritability, maybe once a month or once every couple of months, that's unlikely to be a symptom of depression unless they have a lot of other symptoms of depression. And here's the other thing, is that irritability is also a part of another condition called mania. So people who have bipolar disorder or manic depressive illness can be manic with an elevated mood and irritable. Irritability can occur with anxiety. Irritability can occur with medical conditions. So there's a variety of things that can cause this. And having said that, the vast majority of people who have anger outbursts actually have anger management issues and not a mental illness. And so it's really important to get an assessment. That could be from a family doctor, from a specialist, from a psychologist, who can help to tease apart, is this part of a mental illness such as depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety, or is this truly a behavioral issue that may require anger management?
Thanks so much, Anthony. Anybody else, Joe?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I was going to mention perhaps keeping track of the triggers as well, the things that really lead you to feel angry. Could help you to gather some helpful information about what it is that causes you to feel angry, and you may notice a pattern that may help you just better understand that anger, and just having that information might help you to answer that question on your own, because perhaps it does have something to do with something that's really making you feel sad, but that sadness is coming out as anger, which is really common with anger. I use an analogy called the anger iceberg. And as many of you know, an iceberg, only 10% of it is above water and 90% is below water. And usually when it comes to anger, it's really just that 10% above water that everyone else sees is that anger, but below that anger is 90% of that emotion, usually a lot more complex emotions, whether that be jealousy, being self-conscious, fear, shame, some more complex emotions to manage. And so perhaps by tracking triggers, it'll shed light on which emotions are the primary emotions and really being triggered, but that are actually coming out as anger.
Thanks so much, Joe. So I think at this point, we've actually probably reached the end of our question and answer period. I want to thank you for sending in your questions, and I hope that we've given you at least some tips for starting to address them. I want to thank our speakers for having such an informative discussion. And to our audience members, we hope tonight's discussion was educational and meaningful given the limitations of the current circumstances. Please be sure to take a moment to fill out the electronic evaluation form at the end of tonight's event. This will really help us in planning future talks and topics for you. I know a lot of us really love the speaker series, so please do think about following up on that, because it is always a joy to be able to organize these for the Sunnybrook community. Please do be sure to check out upcoming topics with more details available on the website, and that's at www.sunnybrook.ca. And I think with that, I want to say thank you to everybody.